7.1 Solving quadratic equations. Ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0 is a quadratic equation. If you remember from before, what we did for these types of equations is we set one side equal to 0, and then we factored, and then we were able to solve for x. Well, the question now is, what happens if you get a problem that you can't factor? So if you can't factor a problem, then there should be other methods to solve. One of those methods is to use the square root property. The square root property, let me fix this problem really quick. The square root property is actually used when we have just x squared and no x. Because if you only have x squared, you can isolate the variable on one side, and then we can take the square root of both sides, and then we can solve. The other way that you can use the square root property is if you have a binomial squared on one side and then just a number on the other side. Then we can also take the square root. So what we want to do first is isolate the part that's squared. Subtract 18. Like the name says, take the square root of both sides. Remember to write plus or minus on one side because there are two solutions and we have to include both positive and negative. Take the square root of the left side. We can take the square root of negative 18. It will be an imaginary answer. Negative 18, if you remember, is negative 9 times 2. Square root of negative 9 is 3i, and 2 stays inside the radical. This is our final solution. There are two answers here, positive version and negative version. We write it like this because it's more concise. Second example, we have a binomial squared equal to negative 7. Since this squared part is isolated, I can automatically take the square root of both sides to solve. Plus or minus on one side. Square root of the left side is x plus 2. Plus or minus square root of negative 7 is really square root of negative 1 times 7. Square root of negative 1 is I, so I can just write it this way. This is from chapter 6, I believe, previous chapter. Add 2 or subtract 2. Again, we have two solutions. You can leave your answers like this, which is more concise, or you can separate the two answers. You can write negative 2 plus I square root of 7 or negative 2 minus I square root 7 to separate them, but you don't have to do that. Okay, the next part, last part of this section, is to solve by completing the square. So here is an example. I have a quadratic equation. We have both x squared and x, and there is no way to factor this trinomial according to what we've done before. So there has to be another way to solve, and that is to complete the square. We cannot use the square root property at this point because I don't have x squared by itself. We have x squared and x. So if you have this x part, you don't want to use the square root property at the beginning. The first step to completing the square is to isolate your C term, which means this C value, which in this case is 3, has to be isolated on one side. Subtract 3 from both sides. There's a little bit of space here because we need it for the next step. To complete the square, you need to find b over 2 squared. You do need to memorize this for your test. B in this case is -8. Okay, so what do we do with this value? You're going to add 16 to both sides of this equation. We have to do it to both sides. The reason we're adding 16 is because it's going to make the left side factorable. Okay, look at the left side. This is going to actually factor into a binomial squared. When you factor, you get 2 of the same factors. Okay, so this will always happen that these are the same when you complete the square. And what we want to do is just write this as x minus 4 quantity squared. Okay, why do I want to write it this way? Because now I can use the square root property. If you look at what we have here, it's the same as example B. At this point, I can just take the square root of both sides and we can solve for x. So we take the square root, we get x minus 4 equal to plus or minus square root of 13. Last step is to add 4. Again, there are 2 answers here, but we just write it this way because it's easier. You cannot simplify square root of 13, so we just leave it like that. Last example. So this is also a trinomial, and in this case, this is also not factorable, and we will solve this using completing the square. Really important, compare B to A. This is what you want to notice. Coefficient of x squared for part A is 1. Coefficient of y squared is 3. If you're going to complete the square and find b over 2, then, so if you're going to find b over 2 squared, you need to have a coefficient of 1. If you don't have a coefficient of 1, we need to rewrite the problem to make the coefficient 1 before you do anything else. So how do I make this coefficient 1? Well, all you have to do is divide every single part of this equation by whatever number you have. In this case, that number is 3. Divide by 3 every single part. Okay, 3 over 3 is 1, so I have my coefficient that I need. We get y squared plus 3y plus 3 is equal to 0. Now we can complete the square, but remember you need to subtract this term, move it to the other side. Leave some space. So the formula was b over 2 squared. B is positive 3 over 2 squared. This comes out to be 9 over 4. What do you do with this? You add it to both sides of the equation, so it doesn't change the value, but it will help us factor. So right here, we're going to combine these, get a common denominator of 4, and we can do that here. Let's just combine. On the left side, you need to factor. Remember, when you complete the square, you're going to factor on the left, and you're going to get a binomial squared. Exactly like we got for example A. You got a binomial squared. The same thing is going to happen for part B. Please notice, we added 16 to both sides, and when we factored right here in this position, we wrote 4, and that's just because we factored. But really, the way you get this number is you just take the square root of 16. Square root of 16 is 4, or you factor. If you have a fraction, maybe you think it's harder to factor. I mean, it's not really harder, but what you could do is just take the square root. So it's y plus, it's going to be 3 over 2. And so 3 over 2, the way we get that is you can just quickly take the square root of 9 over 4. And again, this is a binomial squared. It's better to write it that way. On this side, you need to multiply by 4 over 4. And so we're going to get negative 12 plus 9 over 4. And then you subtract here. That's going to give us negative 3 over 4. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. So actually, let's just, when we take the square root, we get y plus 3 over 2 is equal to plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2. How did I get this? Take the square root of 4, that's 2. Square root of negative 3 is I square root of 3. And then all you do is subtract. And that is our final answer.